And thank you for joining us today for our webcast, Preventing Employees from Hoarding Documents, brought to you by Control and today's General Counsel. Before I kick off today's webinar, I'd like to address a few housekeeping items to ensure you make the most of your experience with us today. Please direct your attention to the icons at the bottom of your screen. I'd like to bring your attention to the paperclip resource icon. Here you will be able to download today's slide presentation as well as other subject matter content and resources you'll find of interest. We encourage you to engage with our speakers. Please use the Q&A box and your question will be addressed anonymously throughout the presentation or at the end during our Q&A session. If your question is not addressed during today's live event, someone will follow up with you. If you have a technical question, please also use the Q&A box, as we will monitor this throughout the program and do our best to assist you. As a reminder, we are not offering CLE for today's webinar, and this presentation is being recorded and will be available for on-demand playback. And now it is my pleasure to introduce our distinguished speakers for today's webinar. Mark Diamond, CEO and President of Control, and Tom Miles, COO of Control. Mark, I'll pass the mic on to you.
Thank you very much, Steve. Today we're going to talk about what's probably one of the more frustrating areas for many organizations when they're looking at information management, information governance, which is preventing employees from hoarding documents. It feels like we talked to many different organizations that they have employees that sort of want to save everything forever. And while the employees may like to do that, those hoarding behaviors really create a number of problems and issues. And today we're going to talk about what are some real world practices. How do you do this? What do you actually do? And how do we actually prevent employees from hoarding documents to do that? Just a reminder, Control is an independent provider of information governance consulting services. We don't sell any products. We don't store any documents. We don't do any reactive eDiscovery. So we're going to talk about different technologies and approaches today. And that's really just our opinion. We don't even take referral fees on products. Our experiences of working with quite a few different companies out there, how we see the technologies, it's not because we're selling any of them. And I want to introduce my co-speaker today, Tom. Good afternoon, Tom. How are you doing?
Good morning, good afternoon. It's good to see everybody today.
So Tom, a COO, former litigator. I'm Mark Diamond from Control. Control is the largest independent provider of records management, information governance consulting services. We work with about 30% of the Fortune 500, plus quite a few smaller, mid-sized organizations, nonprofits, public sector groups. And we spend the better part of our week working on issues like this today, about talking about employees hoarding up documents. So I'm just going to sort of jump right into it. And I probably can skip this slide for most of the attendees today, which is if your employees save too much stuff forever or everything forever, or too many files, too many emails, that creates a lot of problems. Why? Well, first of all, you're not going to be compliant with your records policies. If your record policy says, hey, we're going to save it for so long, and you sort of save it forever, why even have a policy to begin with, or why even have a program if you're going to have this over retention of information? Probably more acute across a number of organizations is the over retention of sensitive information, and this can include privacy, it can include corporate confidential information, trade secrets, other things like that. And if you have stuff that you shouldn't be keeping, well, first of all, you may be in violation of privacy rules, because a number of rules out there really limit your ability to save personal information. But also, if you save a lot of stuff you shouldn't have, we look at a lot of the breaches that happened, it's really creating a big problem with the breaches out there, because these large hordes of documents, a lot of it is very sensitive information. This is probably going to be very real. A lot of organizations out there, increased discovery costs and risk. If you have too much stuff, you have to go review it. It can really increase the risk and cost of eDiscovery, and there's a huge frustration. And one area we don't think about too often, but is probably the biggest driver, is is if there's too much clutter out there, if there's too much information, it can have a significant impact on employee productivity and collaboration and other areas like that. So, again, I don't probably need to spend too much of this time here on this, but it creates a lot of problems across many different parts of the organization within information governance programs. All right, so Tom, we've seen 5 different ways of handling this. Give us and we're going to jump into each one of those. What are the 5 different ways you see organizations sort of looking to combat employee hoarding?
So, yeah, Mark, there are a couple of different ways that companies approach it. And I think, frankly, these 5 approaches tend to be, at least the first 4 approaches tend to be approaches that we don't see succeed very often, with the 5th one being the one we probably want to spend a lot more time talking about. The first one that some organizations decide is, well, you know what, we're just going to start with some aggressive deletion, and let's put a 30-day limit on our email, and let's make sure that we're deleting all of these particular items after a year, after 2 years, and let's do it for various reasons that we'll discuss. That is not necessarily a great approach. Approach number 2 is let's just trust that our employees will do the right thing. Let's trust that they will do the right thing and that they will tell us that they're doing the right thing by doing an attestation, by doing some type of declaration that they are following the rules. Again, reasons why we've seen that's not the most successful. One option is periodic pruning. Let's do cleanups, but let's do it periodically. Let's not have a process in place to do it all the time. We'll talk about why periodic pruning is good, and it can be a short-term solution, but it doesn't actually meet or fix the longer-term issue. A lot of organizations look for things like a big taxonomy to say, let's do something really complicated. We have lots of different records and we have lots of different ways to describe them. So let's create a huge taxonomy that will help us organize our information. And as we'll talk about later, the organizations that do it, either 1, never get there because they're so busy creating their taxonomy, or 2, it's just too big and the whole process collapses under the weight of trying to overcomplicate something. We'll talk in the approach number 5 really about what are some of the common sense things to do that organizations can do. Putting the right policies in place, having a place to put information, kind of everything in its place, and keeping the right amount of information, the right amount of time. And then how do we use change management to make sure that we don't go back, that we don't have continuing use of hoarding? We find that tends to be the most successful approaches in organizations. We'll go into quite a bit of detail on that later.
So, we may be disappointing somebody. There's not one silver bullet that will solve this problem. It's really a combination of approach. Well, first of all, it's avoiding the approaches that don't work, and second of all, it's no single silver bullet for having it. But we will argue that if you take the right approach, this is a very solvable problem. And I have one question, which from Pia, that I'm going to postpone a little bit. We'll leave it out there. What happens if the chief, and I imagine the CEO or the general counsel or somebody else says, well, I want to save everything, but I don't want anybody else to do it? How do we deal with that? We're going to answer that question as we go a little bit through. All right. So let's talk about what one approach we just think does not work, which is what we call aggressive deletion. We have seen organizations that say, hey, we've got too much email. We're just going to delete all email that's older than 90 days or 6 months or something like that. Or we're going to take all the old files. We don't need these old files, and we're just going to go and delete them. And you can. I mean, you can programmatically go in and delete this stuff. The problem is when you actually have something like this email and you start deleting it, as an example, that your behavior drives a counter behavior. And we call that counter behavior underground archiving. Employees will go, oh my gosh, they're going to take away my stuff. I may need it. And they may or probably may not really need it. But if that's how they feel, they're going to do this underground archiving. And so what we see is they start saving emails on network file shares, or they put it on their desktop, or they print stuff out, or they put stuff on, DVDs, or they get a USB drive. And so what companies say is, oh, we'll get smarter than that. We'll block the exit. We'll prevent, employees from using USB drives. And that's actually probably pretty good policies. because a lot of malware is introduced through USB drives. And employees, so I had this happen to me. I was at a seminar and a guy came up to me afterward and I said, I really like what you had to say about companies, deleting stuff and the idea that it's better just save stuff at home. And I'm like, whoa, what do you mean? Well, every email I get, every file I get, every one I create and receive and send, I send copies of these messages to my home system. I'm not talking about the laptop, work laptop at home, his home PC. And he said, every 3 months I burn a DVD. And from a compliance or an eDiscovery or risk perspective, that just gives me shudders, the idea that people are doing this underground archiving, but it happens. Or maybe they don't even put it on their personal home computer. Maybe they put it in their email. Maybe they get a Gmail account or something like that. And we may think that we're successful blocking the efforts, but our experience has been if employees really think they need to save stuff, they will be very creative and quite often very successful in saving the stuff. And we all know from a discovery perspective, opposing counsel may come in and say, hey, I'd like to depose a few employees. Now, did you employee ever save or move a document in your home system? Yes. I'm sorry, can you repeat the question? Yes. And so we've seen it happen where all of a sudden you now have to discover, subpoena 500 employees' home systems and look for documents, and it's just a mess. This aggressive deletion doesn't really delete stuff. All it does is makes it much more harder to find, and when it comes up, much more expensive, and oftentimes when it comes back at the worst time out there. So this whole idea that we don't find this to be very successful, and it ends up being a bit of a battle between the employees. And again, what we're going to argue for today is a smarter approach to be able to do this.
And I would only add real quick to that, Mark, that underground archiving that you saw on this slide isn't just the result of aggressive deletion. This can happen anytime that you have a process that doesn't account for good change management, good communications, a smart plan. So underground archiving can happen in multiple places, not just aggressive deletion, and we'll talk about that as we get further in.
The next one is what we call self-certification, and that is there's programs out there you can buy, compliance dashboards where they say, well, we're going to send an email to every employee every month, and we're going to have them click to certify that we're following the records policy and they're not saving stuff. And and if they don't click, well, then we'll get on them. And the problem is that employees may click for the first time, and the second month they may do it. But at a certain point, we've seen this happen where they have all this stuff pile up, and they don't get in trouble. They click it anyway, because I know I'll deal with all those documents that I need to declassify. And pretty soon they don't. And we see a big gap between what the employees have, what they actually have, and what they declare. And well, you're going to get in big trouble if you get this wrong. Well, they may be in big trouble, but that doesn't prevent your organization. And again, you can imagine a litigator saying, well, hold it. You said you didn't have this, but you do have this. I'm not going to trust anything. And so now we're going to have to discover everything all over the place. The threat of you get in trouble if you don't follow the policy, just even if, you have to click to be able to do this, oftentimes, in our view, doesn't work very well. Again, we're looking for a more reasonable, workable, and quite frankly, defensible strategy. All right, Tom, you've seen this one work, and you alluded to this. What's this whole idea between periodic pruning?
Well, so let's think about it, maybe not necessarily as periodic pruning, but the idea of let's get rid of the legacy. A lot of organizations say we have a ton of legacy information, we need to get rid of it, or we want to do a cleanup from these particular areas, and we might do it in a more periodic way. But the general idea is let's take what already exists and clean it up. We've seen this with a manufacturer. They were seeing a lot of over retention of information. They had an electronic cleanup day. They identified the biggest users that were about 10% of the organization. They were able to reduce that information by about 43%. But if you're trying to fix a problem that happened in the past, without addressing how to go forward with it in the future, you are only asking for it to grow back again. And that's what happened with this manufacturer. 18 months later, they had even had more information that was there. And we call this trimming the bamboo. You can trim the bamboo back to a certain point. It will always grow back, and it will grow back more ferociously and in greater volume. So the basic idea is going to be don't think primarily about legacy. Legacy is huge, and it's information It's a lot of information, and it's probably one of the biggest concerns that you have. But if you don't have a go forward strategy that also takes into account what are we going to do from day one moving forward, then your legacy information will just continue to keep growing even after you've done a cleanup.
And I just want to note on this. It always bothers me a little bit if the majority of our deletion is a manual process. You can get charged later with saying, well, your employees deleted the stuff that made you look bad, and you kept the stuff that made yourself look good. And you're in explaining mode. And that may not all be true, but anytime you're in explaining mode, you're not as defensible. And so we'll talk about it. We're much bigger believers in having much more automated processes for being able to do this. Tom, we hear this lament a lot of times saying, well, we have SharePoint. If people would just put stuff in SharePoint, you know, we've got place for everything. If people would just put it there, we wouldn't have this problem. How do we just get people to put stuff in the right place? And sometimes there's a flaw with that approach. What is that?
Well, and I would apply this not just to SharePoint, but I'm sure that many of you have other types of document management or enterprise content management systems that have been classified in the past. Somebody came in and they developed a big, complicated division of tree. What you see there is a taxonomy of here's how we classify information within the organization, that if you're going to do it in SharePoint or if you're going to do it in another tool, you have to fill out a profile. You have to add a lot of metadata in. You have to provide a lot of information. And this is a more traditional approach that we've seen in the past. And there is one big benefit to doing this way. You know that it's being put into the exact right area that it needs to go into, and that you're capturing the metadata that you need to be able to adequately search for that information. The problem we have, though, today, and what we are finding out a lot, is records management, information governance is nobody's day job, and none of your employees' day job, except for the people who are responsible for doing that in the organization. And if they have to spend time figuring out how to fill out a profile, how to navigate a complex taxonomy, they're either not going to do it, they're going to do it poorly, they're going to find a way around it in some way. So we'll talk about some strategies. What we find is the more modern, common sense approach to dealing with it these days is to simplify it for the users. Make it simple. You do some trade-offs. You may not get the same type of metadata. It might be a little bit different, but you have employees who are much more compliant, and you have file areas that are much cleaner and much easier to deal with down the road. So we're seeing this traditional approach as something that really needs to go away, because it makes it much harder for companies to comply with good records programs.
We were one time brought in by a large consumer packaged goods company, global company, and they had spent millions of dollars setting up, I think it was Documentum or something like this. And only like 5% of the documents that were supposed to be in there were being put in there. And they could say, can you figure out why that is? And we actually realized it probably in the first 10 minutes. They had this really complex structure, and you got to put it here, and it's just too complicated, and people didn't have the patience for it. And they ended up putting a personal cache of documents on the side, and then they pretty much ignored it. And so it has to be simpler and easier. Otherwise, people aren't going to use it. All right, so we talked about some things that we don't think will work. We don't think aggressive deletion works. We don't think self-certification or this manually going back and having people delete stuff or having complex taxonomy. None of those strategies we think work very well. Okay, so what does work? We find the way to get employees from stop hoarding document is really a combination of three different things. First is having the right policies. And this is actually a big part of it. Next is having what we call a data placement strategy, which is using it to highly automate this to make it very fast and simple. And the third way, which we'll talk about, is behavior change management. It's how do we communicate, and how do we not only tell people what to do, but win their hearts and their minds to say, this is why you want to do it. And this is why, if you do it, it will make your life as an employee easier. And so again, I mean, if you're looking for the silver bullet, we haven't quite found the silver bullet yet. And even we're seeing a number of the generative AI products out there that can identify stuff to be deleted. And that's a whole nother webinar, which we're doing. But be careful, because that's a form of aggressive deletion. Even if you find it, are you going to drive a counter behavior? So let's sort of jump into this and talk about what works. Now, so here's again, more of the bad news. You want to say, my employees are driving me crazy. Well, maybe it's not them. Maybe it's you. Maybe it's because your organization has a traditional records management policy. And we look at a traditional policy as something that only reflects paper, doesn't really reflect electronic records, so it's not clear. Maybe it's only focused on legal and regulatory requirements and doesn't include business value. We'll talk about that. And to be honest, doesn't really have a consensus with the business. So somebody, saying, hey, you hired some law firm or somebody to build this very traditional records policy that it's set on the shelf, but the business, well, we haven't agreed to this. This isn't what we want to say. And what we find is a lot of times these policies drive non-compliance because it doesn't apply to me, or it doesn't have the information I really need and want to save, or I don't understand it. I mean, all these issues. And you can have the world's most legally correct policy, but if you don't have consensus and understanding and address all of it, it's not going to be very useful. And again, this is going to create the gaps. And when you have the gaps, people are like, whatever, I guess this doesn't apply to me. And so we often find that as a big, and the way it comes up, and it may not be that somebody says, I don't like our policy, but rather maybe you had a breach, or maybe you had a very large litigation, and maybe legal reaches out and says, hey, we got to get better at this. This is driving us crazy, which is very true. We need to be more disciplined. And so they bring in IT, and they said, well, IT wants to delete this stuff, but what's our policy? What should we do with email? Should we delete all the email? No, we need to save some of the email. No, email just causes problems. What about these old files? What do we do? And then before you know it, you pull in the business units and you have this large committee. And the committee meets and they talk about it some more. And well, let's find out what our peers are doing. Well, they asked us the same question. And the committee meets and they do it some more, and the committee meets. And so we see this, everybody, a lot of organizations, we think, we're unique. We struggle on this. No, actually, this is very, very common. Matter of fact, when we talk to new clients, if you haven't gone through this, we're a little suspicious. Usually this happens anyway. Part of this is a policy issue. So let's be smart about it, how we actually do in creating the policies and schedules. And so when we think it's important to rethink your records retention schedule. And we think that one of the key ways of solving the hoarding problem is to have a modern, compliant, and easier to execute records retention schedule. So what's in that? So first of all, we want the schedule to include all different types of media: paper, electronic, files, emails, database data, physical records out there. Hey, if you're life sciences, tissue samples, for example. Second of all, this is very important. We believe that a modern records retention schedule should reflect both legal and regulatory requirements and business value. Now, you may not have a legal requirement for saving some of the business value information, but we believe that it is a good idea to have that included in the records retention schedule. What we're trying to do is develop a consensus. Here's what we want to save. Here's how long. We're on agreement. Now, that doesn't mean, hey, we're going to save everything forever. And it doesn't mean, hey, I need to save this for 18 years. There's a reasonableness to this. But let's capture at the policy level what we want to save and how long we want to save it, and identify what some of the business value is, and lend it itself to be integrated with privacy and eDiscovery and other compliance frameworks, because we have to play well with other. The most important thing is we want a records retention policy and schedule, also known as a data retention policy. We did a session with today's General Counsel last year on this, on integrating your data retention policy, the records retention schedule. We believe it should be the same thing, but something we're following, something we're agreement, something that makes it defensible out there. Now, I had one question out there early on. What do you do when the boss, let's say the CFO or the CEO, says, "I want to save all my stuff forever"? Tom, what do you do in that case? If you got, a very senior executive that says, I need my stuff for much longer.
Well, so there's two ways to think about that. And this is, to a certain extent, a change management issue that maybe we should talk about a little bit later. But there are two ways to think about this. One is, we have seen with many organizations where a more white glove approach applies to the leaders, and that they have a certain different way of dealing with leadership versus the rest of the organization. That way, and it's part of a negotiation. We're going to let you do this. We're going to let you do that. In exchange, we're going to get something else. We're going to be able to make sure that we're being compliant across the organization. That's one approach, and that's for approaches with, I would say, recalcitrant or stubborn leadership. That is an approach that sometimes has worked. Part of the challenge, though, with change management is that if you don't show that from the top down there's support for this, and granted, it says here that the chief has support for everybody else following the rules, just not the chief. That's one thing. But if the organization knows and sees that leadership isn't doing the same thing, then they have trouble accepting it as well. So having that discussion with the chief to say, there's parts of this that maybe you should be adopting. Let's let you keep this information and be able to have access to this, but instead you'll be able to show everybody else that you're doing the rest of the things that they're doing. Find what the balance is for that. Try and see if there is any type of compromise. If not, that white glove approach may be the option that you take.
Yeah, and again, let's be smart about this, and sometimes it's fun to concede. Okay, CFO, if you're the C-level, we'll let you have it. And you need to understand the implications of saving stuff too long. I'm happy to educate on that. Let's not, if there's 10 people we need to do this for, let's worry about the other 2,000. And not focus on the 10. Let's pick our battles. And Tom, I think Tom talked very well about some of the pluses and minuses associated with that. But let's pick our battles. What we're looking for is an overall reduction on this. And don't go to the wall if you're not going to win it. And fine, we'll give you an exception, and it'll be very limited, and you have to do it. But everybody else, we're going to do that. And sometimes that's the best one. But there's no single hard, fast answer on this. We have another question that comes in this slide, which is, how do you decide what's important or not, or what's based on the amount of documents? And we alluded to the idea that we think it's a good idea to have business value. And again, this verges into a whole nother webinar. We actually have a white paper to talk about this. Talk to people. You don't have to talk to everybody. What do you use? What do you need? How often do you refer to it? How do we find, and Tom, I'm going to use words you have used before, which is a Goldilocks perspective. Do we really need it that long or not? And sometimes we can let them save a very small percentage of the documents for a much longer time. It's a bit of a negotiation. And sometimes the idea of an automatic records retention schedule that will push a button that will decide these things for us will not serve you well. And there's an art to doing this, but we want to build a consensus. And a lot of times if people just feel heard from, and how about this? And they're going to be much more likely to follow it later on. But talk to people and understand. We also we have advantage of control. We do this so often. We have a very good idea of what industry norms are. And if somebody sort of does something way outside industry norms, we can go, that's I'm a little suspicious on that. But again, talk to people. And by the time you're done with your schedule, hopefully you'll have a consensus with everybody and to say, hey, this is what we need to save and for how long. And again, it's not going to be 100%, but we want some reasonable with the majority of the business units. All right, now we get into the 5-second rule and the timing of it. Tom, what is the 5-second rule? I guess the first 5-second rule is if you drop food on the floor. The second 5-second rule has to do with records management, information governance. What's the information governance and records management 5-second rule?
Well, this is essentially our opinion that employees will only spend a certain amount of time. This comes back to my earlier comment that this is not their day job. So they'll only spend a certain amount of time in classifying information and putting things in the place that it needs to go to. And that we think that that they'll spend generally, they're willing to give about 5 seconds of their time to think about where that needs to go. If you have a process that takes longer than that, they'll find a way to get around it, or they won't do it, or some other reason why it won't be successful. The bottom line here is, for employees, it needs to be easy. We call it the 5-second rule, but really what it needs to be is a process that helps people comply with your policies in such a way that it doesn't interrupt their real day jobs and it's easy for them to do.
All right. I got such a softball question, I can't avoid answering it. Hannah asks, any advice on creating a document retention policy? Yeah, we do that as a service. Sorry, that's a little bit too much of a software company, but we work with, we do more of this than anybody else out there in terms of creating records retention policies and schedules. And we also have some white papers that we'll announce at the end of it that talk about this too, but we do that as a service. All right, so what does good look like? And we're gonna walk through a couple different ways of good. So this is the next part of it, what we call a data placement strategy. So in this example, for example, I'm a finance employee and I've got this document. Where do I put it? I'm going to give this finance employee 4 different places to put stuff. I'm going to drag and drop it into a finance records or reference or contracts or working documents out there. And when I drag and drop it there, the system will wake up and the system will say, this is a finance record. I have already been programmed, says the system, to save this for 7 years. And here's who can access it. And here's the level of information security being there. All of us have technology in-house today, or almost everybody, that can do this and can highly automate the process. Now we got to teach the system the rules out there, but for any given employee, we only want a few places to put stuff. We don't like those big complicated taxonomies. And this employee, if they want to create folders in the finance records folder, subfolders, they can do that. All I've got to do is drag it and drop it. And once I've done that, the system will take care of everything else. The system will keep it for the right period of time, and barring legal hold, the system will be able to get rid of it. We have technology in place today to be able to do that, which makes this much easier for organizations to do. And it's a question of being able to use it. And so again, we're avoiding the complex taxonomies. We're avoiding having to do lots of manual tagging, having to do so. We just want to teach the rules to the system. And when we classify something, we want to do this for records retention, data security classification, legal hold, and access policy. We want to accomplish that all within 5 seconds to be able to do that. And so now the good news, by the way, if you have something like Microsoft 365, even the base version E3 can do this. If you have other types of repositories, almost everybody in the world has Microsoft 365. So you have the technology in-house today to be able to do this. You don't need to buy any new technology, nor do you typically need to upgrade. Generally, the vast majority of people don't need to upgrade their system to a higher capability or pay more money. You've got this in place today, but it is a configuration exercise. So we can go through, we can set these things up. So all the employee has to do is drag it and drop it. And then all of these rules are then applied to that. We have a question here for the technology is just based on the creation date. We need also account that the update date. Yes, when you configure this right, the technology will realize when the document is created, when we dragged and dropped it, and the clock will start when the document was created, so we don't over retain that. And there's some different ways.
So Mark, I hate to interrupt. Generally, most of our clients will actually ask us to set that for the last modified date. It's not based on the creation date, because a lot of documentation that your employees have, they go back in and they update that information. We don't want to keep it too short if that's a document that frequently gets updated. Although that's a discussion point that we have with the organization, but most of the time they're selecting that last modified date as the time for the purposes of deletion.
We have another question out there. Would this same thing work for emails? Yeah, actually, it's very similar. You can set up areas where you drag and drop your emails, and instead of being folders within your Outlook, PST files, you're actually dragging it into these centralized repositories out there. And so the principle of drag and dropping and having the rules automatically applied works for both files and emails. Now, we actually have, we're going to do a webinar with today's general counsel and one coming up Control where we're talking about this exact detail. I'm sort of glossing over this in detail. We have a lot more information on this, but that's all doable, again, baseline Microsoft 365, as well as other products out there. We don't want to be just a shield for Microsoft, but chances are you already have technology that would allow you to be able to do that today. All right, Tom, talk about this, negotiating with the business units. And we alluded to this. What do you do when you have some employee that says, I want to keep this for a very long time? How do you decide if some employee is being unreasonable about this?
Well, so part of this is that when you are developing a retention schedule, there is actually, to some extent, more of an art than a science in developing it. There are legal requirements that you obviously have to follow, but I will say that no schedule from any company, even in the same industry, necessarily matches each other's, because they all have a different approach to how long they want to keep information. And like you see here, some people will say, I have to be able to keep these types of records to do my job or to do our job for a long period of time. That seems unreasonable, that seems outside of best practice, that legal requirements are nowhere near that. But maybe the idea there, and part of what we see with creating the good schedule, is let's negotiate. Let's keep some of that information a little bit longer, but let's make sure that we're keeping, again, as Mark said, I call it the Goldilocks approach. Let's keep the right amount of information for the right period of time, which is let's agree to keep some of it a little bit longer if the business will agree that here are the retention periods on documents that happen to be higher volume that we want to get rid of sooner, that we want to make sure that we're not multiplying those types of records. We don't have a lot of volume of those coming in. It's a back and forth, and being able to successfully negotiate with the business goes a long way towards gaining consensus. The more consensus you have, the more likely people are to avoid that aggressive or that underground archiving, or find ways to subvert or get around the policies and processes that you put in place.
And sometimes the first behavior change management step is working with the CFO or the general counsel, because they're so frustrated the fact that everybody saves everything forever. They just want to give an edict saying, darn it, we're just going to delete everything and tough. And we oftentimes say, we love the idea of getting rid of a lot of the unneeded stuff, and we think there's large amounts that you can get rid of, but let's be smart about it. We don't want to adopt a strategy that can backfire. And Tom, we talked about working documents. We actually have a question on working documents too. He's saying, if we put in working documents, are they just going to accumulate? What is working documents, and do they accumulate there forever?
So the question is a good question, because if you don't think of a good way to deal with working documents, it becomes exactly like how the question asks, that people would just keep all their files in that folder. The issue with let's define working documents very quickly. Working documents are things that aren't really records. They're not things that you keep in your schedule for the required period of time, but they're the types of, we call them non-records, the types of things you need to do on certain tasks or on a project or ongoing work that you're not going to keep. It doesn't qualify as a record, but you need it for the immediate time period. The way to manage this is to establish an area to put working documents, but put a relatively short retention period on that. 2 or 3 years. We're usually seeing 3 years more often these days. And that would actually be both in email, a working documents folder in email, and out in your areas where you're storing files. What that allows is that allows people to keep the information that they're working on. 3 years is enough for the type of work that they're doing. The last 3 years generally is enough time, but then start to automatically delete that information at the end of the period. That keeps them from storing other records there. It makes it harder for them to hoard, because you've placed an automatic shorter retention period on it than the time that the records themselves probably need to be kept.
And part of what we're saying is a little bit crazy, because we're saying they can put whatever in there, and you're going, hold it, you're creating we have a over retention problem, and now they can put whatever they want in there. How is that helping us? Well, the point is, it's a controlled repository. They can put whatever in there, but the system will automatically delete it 2 years and 1 day after they put it into there. And we're not going to have them put it on these other, underground archiving places that we'll never be able to get, and we can still search them, and we can discover against them and other things like that. And so I know it sounds a little counterintuitive, but we find organizations that have good policies, that have working document retention that have business value actually have much, much less stuff. I mean, you would think you'd have more, but no, because we're getting much more reasonable, and overall they tend to store a lot less of the redundant, obsolete, and trivial. Now, Tom, this freaks out people. When it comes to delete, we're going to automatically delete.
We are going to automatically delete. And this comes back. My theme of this presentation is this is not their day job. And most employees, if they're given the opportunity, they either don't have time to do it or they really don't want to do it. So what we try to do is, again, this is part of simplifying the process, is let's automate it as much as possible. To the extent that you can set it and forget it and it goes away. Our retention period for our finance records is 7 years. From the time that was last modified until 7 years, and it goes away, it should just automatically happen with nobody taking anything, having to do anything with the process, unless there's a legal hold. I'll always say, if there's a legal hold or some outstanding business need for that, otherwise those records should be disposed of automatically. Now, not all records that you have are capable of automatic disposition. Contracts need to expire before you can actually start the retention period. Employees have to leave the company before you can actually start the retention period on their personnel file. But once you do that, once that event occurs, you should be able to enable some automatic disposition for most of the records that you're keeping in your organization.
So what does it look like? And I'm going to go to the email. The email example is emails I want to save. I can save if it's a record. And again, the record will be specific to my role or my area that needs to be configured, or maybe reference information. Or if I want to keep the email for a couple of years or 3 years, I can put in the working documents. And then if I don't move it, then we can go through and clean out the old email. Now, we want to introduce this slowly. We don't want to do this on day one. But we want to teach people. But the idea is, well, because you left it in your email box, you obviously didn't need it. So we're just going to go and clean up the old stuff. But if you need to save it, if it's a record, put it in the right place. But if it's a working document and you can still have it for 2 or 3 years there, that works. This is a strategy that works. This is not aggressive deletion because we're giving them a very viable option of where to put stuff if they need it. And they said, I need it for longer than 2 years or 3 years. Well, talk to us. Is this something we should have in the record schedule? We're going to be open for this. So this is the whole philosophy, again, the right policies and processes and combining with technology to be able to do this. We get the question all the time from, hey, what technology should we use? What technology do you have? Well, we have Microsoft 365. Well, I don't want to say that will do everything for you, but you can go an awful long way with that, or other products out there that you may want to use. Now, Tom, do you want? Let me talk about this one. When you can think of a lot of reasons why this may not work, and part of it we want to get in the psychology of the different employees to be able to do that. And I'm going to use it. My kids are much older now, but when they were little, we had a toy room that was just full of toys. And kids, we have too many toys. Let's give some of these toys away. No, I want the wagon. Kids, you don't need the wagon anymore. You never use it. Let's give it away to somebody else. No, I want it. And it was back and forth and back and forth. And I was not always a great parent because I didn't always win those discussions. I sort of, get worn down. Until my partner, my wife, was very smart and got a plastic bin and put the bins in the garage. We cleaned out the toy room and we put the toys in the bins, and we could see them. We could see everything. We rediscovered some toys because they're much more accessible. And if we want to use a toy, we take it out of the bin and we can move it and play it in the playroom, put it back. And it was in a managed repository, if you will. And then some of the toys disappeared every 6 or 9 months out of the bins to Goodwill out there. But the same toy room analogy I want to give to the world of records management. We want to keep information accessible. Employees need to feel like they can have access to the stuff, because if they don't, they're going to freak out. Even if they do have access, if they don't think they will, they may start doing underground archiving. We want to give users an option, or the illusion of an option. If you really need it, you can pull it back here or talk to us out there. We want to centralize control of deletion. I alluded to this early in the webinar. I don't want, where possible, I don't want employees deleting stuff, because that can drive non-compliance. That's less defensible. I'd rather doing it an automated routine process. And in our strategy, once they put stuff in the right place, they have to do nothing else. They don't have to go back. They don't have to look. They don't have to just put it here. That's all you need to do. And then the process will take care of itself completely from there on. And so this is the hallmark of our view of what makes it a really good strategy. And so, you know, a big part of this is really around success management. Behavior management. Tom, talk about how does behavior change management play a role in this?
The challenge with hoarding is that it's become the paradigm at your organization. It's become what has always happened, for especially where you haven't really had a policy, where you haven't really enforced anything. So the culture is embedded in each employee that, well, we just keep everything because that's better. And from a risk perspective, that's both good and bad. It's good because they're rule followers. They want to do what's right, and keeping everything forever is what seems right to them because they haven't been told otherwise. Obviously, keeping everything forever has its own risk associated with it as well, which is why change management is so important. You want to go from the paradigm of we're saving everything everywhere and it's my information. There is certain proprietary feeling about information, thinking it's mine rather than ours, rather than the company's information. And you want to move from that, saying we're only going to put information in the right repositories. We're going to have appropriate use and access. Again, Goldilocks approach, everything in the right place for the right amount of time with the right amount of access. At making sure everybody knows, here's what our responsibilities. If you have rule followers, you should be able to say, these are the rules we want you to follow. And hopefully it will be a little painful at the beginning because people will be thinking they're used to keeping everything forever, but now they have to think in a slightly different thought process. But show them the benefits. Show them the fact that the less stuff you have, the productivity is better. The more organized you have, the more, if people go out and they find all of these abandoned folders when people leave the organization, or multiple folders for the same thing, and you're not sure where did we put this information because there's 3 folders in here that say human resources. Sell them on the benefits of that. Show that these are the rules we need to follow, and this is ultimately going to be a good thing. And change management is arguably the most important thing you will do in any of this. Getting all your information organized and in the right places is super important, but having people understand it and be willing to follow it, I think, is arguably even more important than that.
We have a couple questions. I'm going to try and knock these off real quickly. How do you segregate information from a litigation hold so that it doesn't get automatically deleted? Well, the short answer is you need a legal hold process. And a lot of the tools, for example, like Microsoft 365, you can implement legal hold. So even if the retention period, the document's expired, it will not delete it until the legal hold is deleted. But you need a process, and technology allows you to preserve documents so you don't spoliate, you don't inadvertently delete something that you needed to preserve on that. We have another question here. What's the definition of a record versus a document, or similar? We could do a whole seminar on that one. Sometimes organizations artificially or historically have created what we call big R records with legal and regulatory requirements versus documents. We don't like that. We'd rather see the records retention policy and schedule contain both the traditional records retention definition and documents that we have a business value or business need for saving for some time. We're seeing a big shift away from traditional records retention schedules where they only address legal and regulatory requirements, and we're seeing much more inclusive records retention schedules that have that. The other, we could easily spend an hour on this. Sometimes this also becomes a bit of a political issue because IT is responsible for data and documents, and somebody else is responsible for records. And so getting together on that. But again, we like records retention policies and schedules that address all data and documents for both legal and regulatory requirements, business value, personal information, that whole area.
If I could add to that, Mark.
Yes.
So the definition that we use as a record for record is any type of information, record, document, any type of file, data, anything that concerns the business, number one, and two, is included in your record retention schedule. So it could be for either legal requirements or business requirements. Those are the two requirements to make a record. Concerns the business and is included in your retention schedule. A document we consider to be a format issue. It's not, it's a format, a file, a document. Those are types of, a document or file can be a record, but maybe not a record. So we think about them in slightly different ways. Record is what you really want to pay attention to.
Although, again, the nomenclature gets really mixed all over the place, and there's a different organization called differently. Another question, can you speak of the risks of preserving data over business purposes and running foul of privacy laws? Well, actually, we have an entire white paper on that. So, Jessica, I'm not going to answer that question now. Yes, your schedule should manage that, but we have a whole white paper that talks about that exact topic, and we have recorded webinars that talk about that too. So I'm going to punt on that just for a matter of time.
Well, the short answer is your schedule should be able to explain why we keep information, the period of time we keep it, in order to comply with our privacy laws. And again, the white paper will explain more about that, but that's the short answer.
Yes, but I like the fact you're asking those questions. That's good. All right. When we go out there, you may think, well, hey, we're trying to save some stuff for less. How do we convince I alluded this, how do we win their hearts and minds? Well, you come back to them and you said, hey, we talked to you. You told us you're drowning on email. You told us you don't have time to organize. You told us that every time you write something, you don't know if it's the right version because somebody else may have updated it since then. Or the VP I talked to that saying the VP of HR that came in and she was saying, I spent the first 3 months of my job looking through my predecessor's email box. Your over retention, you think your employees love over retention. Chances are they don't, because there's a lot of latent pain because they save everything forever. You know, this garage is full of clutter. You got so much clutter in the garage, you can't find anything. And that same psychology applying to that, saying, hey, let's get rid of the clutter. We want to save the important stuff, the stuff that's value of you. But when you save everything forever, you're saving a lot of clutter that prevents you from finding the important stuff. So we want to be smarter about how to do it. And this is part of the messaging and communication, finding the pain. And by the way, don't announce your program saying, hey, we've got a new program. The new program is we're going to delete everything. We're going to delete 60 or 70% of your emails and an equivalent amount of files. And that may be your goal, and that may be the result of the program. But if you announce it like that, you're going to scare people off. Instead, say, we want to find the 30% that's really valuable, and we want to get rid of the 70% of the clutter out there so you, the employees, can be more productive and more collaborative with the valuable information. Now, we just said the same thing, but we said it differently. And so how you message and communicate this. And Tom, I don't know if you want to talk about this case study real briefly about creative employee engagement.
Yeah, so I mean, I think that every organization wants to think about a different way to approach the idea of hoarding or of good change management with their employees. And this is one organization that we worked with. They decided to engage a marketing creative agency to develop these monsters. They wanted to have information management. It was taming a monster. You could go and take a quiz that would tell you whether you are a file fiend or a giant hoarder, and you'd get a sticker to put on your cubicle or on your desk. But it was a way to personalize the process, to make it more engaging and exciting, and recognize that everyone is a monster. Everyone has the same issues. So what are we going to do about it? How do we deal with it? It turned out to be a very successful approach that they used with the employees, because it was funny, it was fun, it was something they could engage in, and it was something they could relate to and follow.
Really quick question here. Difficulty with legal hold repositories allow custodians to make the decisions. Legal may not be able to make those decisions. You know, your question there, Lisa, is really we're a big believer in having a discovery response process, a repeatable, defensible process that asks these questions. And so right now we see a lot of organizations do that fairly informally out there, and having a documented process so what you do is defensible. And again, that's an entire another webinar topic we'd be happy to go into.
The goal is to get a repository that does not allow that. And again, we probably need more time to talk about that, but the goal is to find places where custodians don't have that kind of power.
All right, Tom, real quickly, what do you do when people push back?
There's always going to be pushback. You might get it from just the random person who's been there for 40 years and all their information is very important. It might be from the people who are new, who did something new at a different company. You want to make sure, though, that you're not just ignoring them and saying, this is the law, this is what we've decided, you need to follow it. Understanding what they want, understanding what they need and what they're afraid of will help you find a solution. And maybe there's a way to address what their issue is. Maybe they actually have a legitimate issue that you were previously not aware of. Don't dictate that policy. Find out what individuals need. If necessary, bring in what other companies are doing and maybe ways that people are doing it. Again, change management hopefully helps with this. It hopefully helps with the pushback, but to the extent that you're going to get it, listen to them, understand the ideas, and then try to work with them to reach some type of compromise on a solution.
Sometimes there's a fear of engaging the business units or talking to people because they're just going to demand they save everything ever. But the reality is the opposite. Once you listen to people, once they get it off their chest, they get a lot more reasonable in what they want to do. All right. So I'm going to try and pull this all together. And I know we're putting a lot of content in this one presentation and lots of great questions. What does good look like? You know, how do you set up this anti-employee hoarding type of environment? Well, to review, any given employee has a few places to put stuff. It's real simple. It's real fast. They can store emails or files within 5 seconds. When they put it there, all the rules are applied. The record retention, data security classification, legal hold, who can access it. That's all programmed into it. Once stuff is in there, it makes life easier because you can find stuff. You can search stuff. You don't have to bring your laptop with you on vacation. At the right time, when it's ready to get rid of stuff, the system does it automatically, assuming it's not on a legal hold. We're not creating drama. We're not trying to say, hey, I want you to delete all this stuff, which they probably won't do or do it consistently. The system sort of does that. And then if we need to do legal holds, if we need to do searches, we can do it with little or no user involvement. It's a much more automated system. And again, the right policies, processes, oftentimes with technology that you already own today. And we sometimes hear this too. I've never seen this work. Tom, you've seen this work.
I have seen it work. We had an insurance carrier who came to us. They had about 7,500 employees, very regulated insurance environment. They were not deleting any email at that point in time. They had a save everything culture, which we've been talking about a lot today. And the reasonable approach that was taken was, let's go and interview the employees. Let's understand what they're doing, what they need to do, what they want to do. Talk to IT, talk to legal, understand the risk issues, understand the infrastructure and the capabilities of what's out there. Then work through with the stakeholders about what the options are, what can be done, what are the pros and cons of those approaches, and come to a consensus on what the right approach is. That was both balancing what the business said, here's what we need, with the legal risk, with the regulatory risk, with any other issues that are a problem with records management. Senior management understood it, they bought into it, and then employee training, again, was tailored to help them understand that, yes, this is something we need to do, but here's all the benefits that it will provide to you. They turned the switches, and there were 400 million emails that were deleted with almost no complaints. That we heard very little pushback. They knew it was coming. They knew what was going to happen. They understood that email was going away. And when it happened, there was not a lot of complaints from it. So it was almost, we can't promise that that's going to be perfect in every instance. But if it's managed in a reasonable, common sense way, it's something that it can be successful.
Not really an easy button for this, but it is very doable. Now I've got a question here. What do you do with paper boxes? Again, that's a whole nother webinar we'd be happy to do. Paper boxes, first of all, teach people they don't need to print stuff on paper, that they can preserve stuff electronically. And second of all, negotiate with your offsite paper vendors because there's a lot of work to be done with that. And third of all, creating a repeatable, consistent process for cleaning up the old paper and then making sure you don't put new paper in there. And we got some white papers on that too. If you want to email us, we'll be happy to be able to present that. I got a few more questions, but real briefly about Control. We're the largest independent provider of information governance, including records management, AI governance, and privacy consulting services. We work with more than 30% of the Fortune 500. We do this all the time. Pure services provider. We do create policies and schedules. We do training. We do the data placement strategies, everything that we talked about. And again, we do more of this than anybody else out there. and very, very successful at it. I have another question: is how do you manage the politics of this? Well, we have a suggestion. We actually do a complimentary seminar, coming in and getting all your key stakeholders talking some of the similar content. We customize it for each individual one that we talked about here, but get your legal, get your IT, get your business units, InfoSec, get your privacy, get records management, everybody together, and we can talk about what best practices are. Sometimes just explaining that there's a bigger, smarter, better way of doing this helps avoid the conflict on that. And the other thing we explain on this is these are almost always cross-functional exercises. It's very difficult to do this for a single one out there.
I would only add to what Mark said is for the in-house seminar, the way to manage the politics is to get all of those people onto a steering committee that give you direction on how to manage the program, because putting them all in a room together will help with consensus. If you have siloed groups, having them all talk, because they all deal with different issues of the records management issue, having them on a steering committee together will go a long way towards helping with that.
And if we didn't get your question answered, feel free to email us. Just email me, mdiamond@control.com, and if you want to spend 10 or 15 minutes on the phone with, of course, I'm not going to charge you. I'm more than happy to talk if you want to want more detail on some of this. Or we alluded a number of white papers. Just look for our website, or if you just want to email us, we'll send you the white papers on that. And I think with that, we are officially out of time, Tom. And so hey, thank you, everybody. Great questions, great interaction. That always makes it very interesting. We're very pleased with that. And so thank you, Tom, for your insight. And we wish you success. I mean, this is a tricky problem. It's a frustrating problem, but if you're smart about it, it's doable. So we wish you success as you prevent employees from hoarding documents. Thank you very much.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, Mark and Tom, and thank you to our audience. We hope you found the webinar informative, and for those who asked questions that were not answered today, please know someone will follow up with you. Also, if you haven't done so already, please be sure to download the resources, complete the short survey, or ask any last questions you may have using the open-ended survey section or the Q&A box. Finally, as a reminder, you will receive a link to this presentation for on-demand viewing and to share with members of your team who you think would find this conversation of interest. Thank you again for joining us today, and we look forward to hosting you again at our next event. Have a great day, everyone.